Okay, guys, welcome to our presentation for week 8 on women, peace and security, or securitizing women. And we are going to be looking at the case study of the OSCE, and we're going to look at their intervention in 3 countries, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in Ukraine. So we thought we'd give you guys a brief introduction to who OSCE are, and they're the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and it's the world's largest regional security organization. They've got 57 participating states in North America, Europe, and Asia, and they have a comprehensive approach to security that encompasses political, military, economic and environmental and human aspects. It's therefore addresses a wide range of security related concerns, including arms control, confidence and security building measures, human rights, national minorities, democratization, policing strategies, counterterrorism, and economic and environmental activities.
The OSCE and Women, Peace and Security. So on the 31st of October 2000, the United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. And since then, they've produced research reports and training manuals, built competent and most importantly worked to support women at the grassroots level in their efforts to prevent conflict. So the OSCE promotes women's leadership and empowers female professionals in conflict prevention and management, peace processes, arms control and disarmament, and in their security sector, as well as women in policing, at the borders, in the armed forces, in crisis management, and at the negotiating table. At the OSCE, they have adopted a gender parity strategy, aiming to reach parity between male and female staff by 2026. They have achieved parity at the lower and mid-professional levels, but at the level of senior and head of mission posts, they are still lagging behind. So what is Resolution 1325? And how does it relate to women, peace and security? The resolution reaffirms the important role of women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts, peace negotiations, peace buildings, peacekeeping, humanitarian response, and in post-conflict reconstruction, and stresses the importance of their equal participation and full involvement in all efforts for the maintenance and promotion of peace and security. On the screen are some screenshots of the urges the UN have made within this resolution. Resolution 1325 urges all actors to increase the participation of women and incorporate gender perspectives in all United Nations peace and security efforts. It also calls on all parties to conflict to take special measures to protect women and girls from gender-based violence, particularly rape and other forms of sexual abuse in situations of armed conflict. The resolution provides a number of important operational mandates with implications for member states and the entities of the United Nations system. Previous UN resolutions had treated women solely as victims of war in need of protection, but the Resolution 1325 also recognised women as agents in building peace and guaranteeing security. Anderlini and Terman say that it is rooted in the premise that women's inclusion, their presence and participation in the political process, their perspectives and their contributions to the substance of negotiations will improve the chances of attaining viable and sustainable peace. However, Resolution 1325 neglects some aspects according to Arusi. Although the recent portrayals of sexual violence as a weapon of war have brought much needed attention to widespread sexual abuse of women in conflict, it has tended to reinforce a singular narrative about why sexual violence occurs in war, obscuring the links to sexual violence before and after the war and outside conflict zones. It has also contributed to the silencing of other forms of gender-based violence that are prevalent in conflict situations, like high levels of intimate partner violence and trafficking and sexual violence against men. So to give you an idea of the issue of violence against women in Serbia, there is significant concern. 5 out of 6 of the women surveyed by the OSCE said that violence against women is common, and over a third think that it is very common. More than a quarter personally knows someone among their family and friends who has been subjected to violence against women, and a similar proportion knows someone in their neighbourhood who has been a victim of violence against women. Many have heard of services to help affected women. 73% had heard of at least one of the 3 organisations asked about. However, few women have accessed those services. Following the most serious incident of physical and/or sexual violence, only 3% contacted a women's shelter and 1% a victim support organisation. So the OSCE works with Impulse, an NGO which helps to tackle domestic violence against women in Serbia. It was founded in 2000 as a form of resistance to patriarchy and war, and it was founded by us feminists, anti-militarists, activists for human rights. So what do? They help women and youth to recognise gender-based violence and different forms of discrimination, nationalism, homophobia, misogyny, and racism. They're assisting women and young girls in breaking away from a violent environment, strengthening themselves in order to become active members of society through education, seminars, meetings, and campaigns. They're raising the general and professional public's awareness about the issue of violence as a social problem, connecting various local institutions that operate in the system of family violence, protection, and gender-based violence, then strengthening their capacities in order to provide adequate protection to women who survived violence. They're also connecting women and women groups from the region through activism and art. So pictured below are some of the practical ways that the OSCE and Impulse have helped promote greater peace and security for women against gender violence. So picture 1 shows a training programme for employees for implementing the protocol on dealing with women who have survived male violence. Picture 2 shows a psychosocial support group for women and girls in refugee camps. OSCE and Impulse also offer training on working with women who have survived male violence and consultations for the women themselves. They also do workshops for raising integrated security, self-care and well-being, and feminist talks. They also celebrate what they call the Festival of Female Friendship. This collaboration between OSCE and Impulse is an example of increased funding and programming focused on the protection and participation of women in conflict situations. And this has provided a great framework for women and women activists to use to mobilise. However, the focus just on women ignores wider gender relations, and women's agencies tend to be constrained by particular expectations and norms about how women can articulate their priorities. So an overview of the action in Serbia. The visibility of women's representation in the security system, their place and role in maintaining peace and security in the Republic of Serbia was achieved. All institutional bodies for the implementation of the National Action Plan were established, as well as the majority of gender equality mechanisms envisaged by the plan. The measurability of the effects of the envisaged measures and activities contained in the National Action Plan was achieved through indicators. The total representation of women in the security system increased by 4.13% from 27.4% in 2010 to 31.5% in 2015. The total representation of women in decision-making in the security system increased by 5.21%. Between 2010 and 2015, and the participation of women from the security system and the activities of international cooperation increased. All forms of education, military and police. However, official peace processes remain dominated by male fighters and politicians. There are a number of clear downsides to the application of security language to women's rights issues. Language can promote an essentialist and narrow view of women as communal peacemakers and mothers, and has the potential to reinforce the pressures on women to return to traditional, more nurturing roles in the home after violent conflict ends.
So the next country that we are looking at was the OSCE's interventions in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So they joined the OSCE in 1992, and by the early 2000s, they'd set up 2 gender centres. And in 2003, the gender equality law was passed at the state level. So this law meant that they wanted gender equality in all spheres of society, including the economy, education, employment and labour, health and social care, public life and media, irrespective of marital or family status. The main concern in Bosnia and Herzegovina is the lack of political representation and intimate partner violence and gender-based violence. Also, a big part that was flagged up doing research for this was that women are overrepresented below the poverty line, and it was single women head of households, elderly women, internally displaced women, women refugees, women with disabilities, and Roma women were overrepresented. And there was a high prevalence of psychological violence carried out at an intimate partner level, with 36% of women affected, closely followed by sexual harassment, which is at 28%. One of the larger issues as well to do with this is that 1 in 20 of cases reported of intimate partner violence were by the victim herself, which then means that 19 of these cases obviously was through a family member most of the time. This is because of a mistrust of institutions and also a lack of support for victims, with 25% of women being surveyed saying that they think intimate partner violence should be solved within the family. Also a big issue to do with employment, and it's only 1 in 3 women are actually in work in Bosnia and Herzegovina at the time when the OSCE started their intervention. Next slide, please. So the main thing that we were looking at was their gender action plan, which is one that they've recently set up. So this was for 2018 to 2022, and they had 3 core strategies, which was the development, implementation and monitoring of the programme of measures for advancement of gender equality within governmental institutions, establishing and strengthening the system, mechanisms and instruments for the achievement of gender equality, establishing and strengthening cooperation and partnership. And the government of the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina budgeted 200,000 of their currency for the implementation of the law of the protection from domestic violence, which is around £100,000. And also specifically Article 24 of their new law on gender equality, I thought was interesting because it's to increase the amount of women's participation in the military. And there's a lot of policy that's framed around this. And there's also specifically a lot of policy around the violence against women, which we'll talk about a bit more later. Next slide, please. So we just wanted to look at the implementation and the overview of the OSCE's intervention. So one of the main issues was representation, which is now up in Parliament, which is up to 28.5% of representatives in Parliament. This is as of 2019, but the aim is for 40%. So obviously there's a bit more of a way to go. And in the general elections for 2018 to 2019, there was only 1 female MP. There's been 5 safe houses set up for women suffering intimate partner violence. They've set up a SOS telephone line, so it means that there's 24-hour support for women if they're suffering, and it's free as well. So that was set up by one of the gender institutions they have. And also in terms of peacekeeping, women are involved in 30% of peacekeeping now, which is up 14% from 2010. And they've had good practice being recognised internationally, and then being able to work in the action plans in other countries such as Switzerland. There's been an acknowledgement to the lack of knowledge or priority for these action plans, even amongst the gender equality commissioners, explaining the lack of progress. And also there's been an acknowledged lack of funding as well. So I think we've been a little bit critical, thinking that they could have made a few more changes, but I think if even their gender commissioners haven't prioritised it as much, it would make sense why it's a little bit harder to look up what they've been getting up to. Also, women now make up 15% of the country's police force, up from 6%, but that's mostly in lower roles. So there's more female employment, but it's at lower levels. Yeah.
Let me tell you about OSCE intervention in the Ukraine conflict. The revolution, annexation, and rebellion have been happening in Ukraine. That was part of the Soviet Union until 1991. The conflict initially started in 2013 when Ukrainian president announced to refuse the trade deal with European Union, taking bailout of Russia instead. The thousands of people protested because EU trade deal was the future of the economic growth. The many factors shaped the worsening of the conflict situation, including geographical, historical, cultural, and ethical grounds, which Ukraine divided between Eastern region with a close historic and cultural ties to Russia, and Western region identified as more Ukrainian, willing to close relationship with Eastern Europe. The Eastern Ukrainian region of Donbass, which consists of the Donetsk and Luhansk provinces, has been fighting between the Ukrainian government and pro-Russian rebels since 2014. The conflict started shortly after the Russian annexation of the Crimean Peninsula. As a result, from April to July 2014, over 1,000 people died and over 100,000 people displaced. To this day, fighting continues in the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine, trapping over 6 million people in contested area. As of April 2020, OSCE recorded in total 3,055 conflict-related civilian deaths, most of them civilian people. Furthermore, there was a 76% increase in reported cases of domestic violence and sexual violence in Donetsk region, and 158% increase in Luhansk region in 2018. However, the data was likely to increase in reality because it was only conducted in limited location due to the armed conflict. As Amnesty International has had no access to separate controlled areas, which fall beyond the scope of the report. Next slide, please. The OSCE project coordinator in Ukraine was established in 1991 with a focus on democracy and good governance and rule of law and human rights and human security. Since the conflict arises in 2014, OSCE's special monitoring mission to Ukraine was deployed by a request of Ukraine's government and consensus decision by all 57 OSCE participating states in order to help Ukraine to reduce tensions and facilitate the dialogue between all the sides. It also biggest opportunity to push governments to implement women peace and security agenda during ongoing conflicts through OSCE mission. OSCE committed to increase the budget significantly by over 3 million euro to the Ukraine mission. Next slide. The mandate of the mission covers the entire territory of Ukraine, including conflict zones, and consists of almost 700 unarmed civilian monitors from OSCE participating states and local staff to provide the back channels for communication between Ukraine and Russia, without either publicly acknowledging the claims of the other. It is significant help to diffuse tensions between Russian speakers in East Ukraine and Ukrainian government. Another important highlight was the government of Ukraine launched its first national action plan on implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in 2016 and amended in 2018 and 2020 with the support of OSCE. This national action plan covers all 4 pillars of Women, Peace and Security Agenda, including participation, prevention, protection, as well as relief and recovery. Particularly, OSCE provides a technical support to implementation of the prevention and participation pillars of the National Action Plan. They provide capacity building training for law enforcement institutions on addressing SGBV, because the internal issues of National Action Plan focus on include prevention of domestic violence, human trafficking, and awareness raising for survivors. The National Action Plan also aims to increase the number of women in military civil administration in Eastern Ukraine. The external issues of this plan focuses on include having more women in peacekeeping missions and training social service agencies and armed forces in assisting survivors of SGBV. In response to this pillar, OSCE made effort to engage women's participation from participating states to the Ukrainian mission. Also, OSCE Scholarship for Peace and Security program launched in 2017, involving over 150 young female scholars from participating states and gave opportunity to work in Ukrainian mission, especially armed conflict zones. Despite the achievements on implementation of Women, Peace and Security Agenda through OSCE intervention and Ukrainian National Action Plan, there are still fundamental challenges exist, such as lack of funding, a strong political will and commitment, and active civil society organizations are needed, particularly clear involvement of the local NGOs and women in the process of development, participation, and monitoring in the National Action Plan. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, one of the key positive development can be seen an increase of the number of national action plans from 27 to 36 during the last 5 years. Over 60% of OSCE participating states now have national action plan on women, peace and security agenda with the support of OSCE. OSCE is also providing technical assistance tools and guidance on how to adopt and localize the women, peace and security agenda, which was significant. Growing commitment at the national level is also reflected in frequent discussions on women, peace and security during the formal OSCE meetings in Vienna. Secondly, monitoring and reporting in the armed conflicts and conflict-related SGBB are improved significantly in the OSCE's mission, namely Ukraine, Bosnia, and Serbia. As a chief monitor, Yasar Hafiz Safik said that the special monitoring and mission works to achieve gender parity in its own ranks, and it integrates a gender perspective in its activities, most notably in the areas of monitoring and reporting, thereby enabling it to effectively implement its mandate. Furthermore, there has been an increased focus on prevention since 2014, and national action plans have begun to feature emerging women, peace and security issues such as disasters, violent extremism, violence perpetrated by peacekeepers and soldiers. For example, issue relates to accountability for sexual abuse, exploitation, and SGBB by peacekeepers. This is a matter of pressing concern to OSCE participating states. The majority of the national action plans from OSCE region mention the need for specific training and accountability mechanisms for troops deployed on the peacekeeping missions. Additionally, national action plans give more space to women's rights organizations, even though women's participation neglected in the peace negotiations. In terms of the obstacles and barriers of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, it is the biggest disappointment that there is always lack of funding and lack of meaningful women's participation since the 1325 agenda reinforced. After 20 years of implementation, 86% of participating states' national action plans have minimal or zero information on the budget or financing mechanism. It led to limit the existing women-led NGOs to raise their voice efficiently at the grassroots level. Moreover, many national action plans just mentioned the pillar of recovery. There were no any clear provisions on how to address and how to deliver recovery process. Lastly, in all national action plans on women, peace and security agenda, there are no space or any information on violence against LGBTQI. It is obviously that violence against LGBTQ people during conflict have been overlooked and neglected in the world. As Jamie J. Hagen highlighted, after many years of advocacy and policy action related to the women, peace and security architecture, the continued silence about homophobic and transphobic violence targeting LGBTQ individuals in conflict-related environment is alarming. Those vulnerable to insecurity and violence because of their sexual orientation and gender identity remain largely neglected by the international peace and security community. This neglect is in the part result of heteronormative assumptions in the framing of the women, peace and security agenda. Thank you for your attention.